I've got an interesting topic, and it's something that the way we framed it initially, I was set to think, I do this all the time. So now I've spent about 3 days recasting this, and I'm not sure what's going to come out, but let me begin by saying that I've recast the title. So the title is that we have is Islam and Sharia in American Popular Culture, Halal or Haram. I can shorten it and just say Islam and Sharia, are they halal or haram in American culture? And then I can shorten it more and say the verdict for many is haram. And I'll come back to that and why that's an issue. But Muhammad sent me this cute little note when we were going back and forth on the topic. And I have an exact quote here. You could always just talk about the immense probability threat of the implementation of Sharia law on a small town in Texas. Just a thought with a smile. So, as God would have it, 2 weeks ago, I'm on a long scheduled speaking tour to Dayton, Dallas, and Houston, kind of a long weekend. It's part of a project, the talks are Standing with the Prophet, that's the title. And the idea is it's a fundraiser for Sound Vision for a project that they have. And I've done 2 for them already, so it's going across the country. The idea of Standing with the Prophet in the fundraiser is to say, in many ways, that the Prophet for many, both, I mean, for Muslims, but certainly also non-Muslims, only for some in a negative way, is the symbol for Islam. And so people will often go after the Prophet, as it were. Well, they go after Sharia, as you know now. So the horrendous attack takes place in Paris about 4 days before this. Well, within a couple of days, a group in Dallas, actually it was in Gardner, which is outside of Dallas, but it's Dallas proper, that tends to get involved in anti-Muslim, anti-Islam activities, okay? Some of its members have a Tea Party persuasion. They start going to the local media in Dallas. And it's 5 speakers, Siraj Wahaj, whom I've known for years, myself, etc. So the media gets heated, but it's primarily the 2 of us, and even more Siraj than me, okay, but it winds up. But to show you, I'm using this example because this example will give you an idea of really the heart of what I would say, which is that popular culture is framed for the last decade, and increasingly today, popular culture is framed by the internet, which we all know, in terms of social media. It's not TV. I mean, O'Reilly can tell us that he's got the most popular show in the world, and that may be true. It is true in terms of book sales. So those of you who think of doing book sales, if you can just swallow your pride and go on, you will see your book, I'm not kidding, within an hour after being on his show years ago. It spikes, makes Al Jazeera look like a ripple. And Al Jazeera used to do really well. Pamela Geller gets involved. Pamela, bless her heart, decides, oh God, you are taping it, edit this out, okay? She's going to fly into Dallas, okay? So I said to the organizers, she's stalking me, it's sexual harassment, and I said to the guy who ran it, I looked at him in the face and said, please, whatever you do, don't book us in the same room, it'll just create rumors. It went right over his head. And then when he realized what I was saying, it didn't go over his head at all. Okay, so Pamela gets on, and this is the important thing, what social media can do. She gets on and starts mobilizing the troops, as she did with the Park 51, the so-called Mosque at Ground Zero. Suddenly, this goes viral on the internet. And so we've got Pamela saying she's flying in. Somebody else from LA is coming, from New Orleans. You have emails that I found out later. I knew there was a lot of stuff on, but I wasn't looking at emails like, I live outside of Dallas. I've got my guns loaded, and when I bring them back, they won't be loaded. Is anybody bringing dynamite? And worse. You've got Hell's Angels bikers. They're not Hell's Angels, but look like it bikers come in, and they block off all the roads. You have 4 to 500 protesters. The figures vary on this, but we're talking, it was huge enough that I don't think this has ever happened in Dallas. It was huge enough that when we went to go, the place was crawling with police, SWAT teams, which I'd never seen, And if I remember, they had a helicopter, and they had some FBI outside and inside the building, okay? And we had personal bodyguards, okay? All of that's generated. Now, the next step, though, in that process was, and this is the other thing, it used to be that you have mainstream media, and then people pick up, they read something, and then they get on the internet. It's just the opposite now. When anything goes viral, so of course, who gets it? But our friend, Bill O'Reilly, before the program. And so he wanted to have me get on the program, but I decided I couldn't make it because it was a distance to get there. And so I asked, some of you may know, Imam Mujahid from Chicago, Sound Vision. So I spoke with him about doing it. And he did an excellent job. But the point is, you had Pamela getting this issue, this little meeting in Gardner, a fundraiser, a community fundraiser, turning it into a national event. She turns it into a national event. That mobilizes people not only locally, but nationally. You then create this scene for a confrontation, but just before it gets hyped when Bill O'Reilly does it on national, that reinforces it, and then ends by saying, how did he put it? I'm going to send somebody down there, representing him. And so you've got this big event. At the event, you have a situation where some interfaith people come. Isn't it nice to have interfaith people come? Well, they come. Little do they expect that some of the protesters are going to jump the barricades, the police barricades, and start punching them. So then you wind up with, it didn't get too much out of control. The irony about this, and you can get rid of all this thing in the first part, or you can leave it on. I don't really care. I'm leaving town, so it doesn't matter, and nobody knows where I live. The reality of it is that we had personal bodyguards as well. The personal bodyguards were, among others, the most impressive were 3 guys who were in incredible shape and who all served in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. In great shape, but they all now, one of them was they all had really good jobs. One of them was a software engineer with Microsoft. The other one was this. They were all Hispanic, and they shared one other thing in common. And that's what it would have been fun to say publicly. They all were converts to Islam. And they had all converted, I think, either as a result or after they're actually being in the Middle East, then getting interested and reading, etc. But it would have been perfect for that crowd to kind of say, and our bodyguards are all, especially since we had. It turns out that one of the fellows on the other side, as it were, the protesters, was somehow identified himself as a veteran, and actually then wound up in a conversation with our security guy because they shared a lot in common. I think they were also Marines. I've learned. My father was a Marine, but you never say ex-Marine. Marines take a big thing on you. Once a Marine, always a Marine. When I came out of the monastery, they were ready to draft me, and I thought, I love my dad, but 10 years in a monastery, you're just coming out, and now you're going to go into the Marines and fight in Vietnam, a war I didn't believe in. That was really cool. Okay, so now, here we are. When I get into the field, Islam and Muslims were not on anybody's list. Educationally, government, communities, etc. When I finished, as some of you know, if you've heard my presidential speech, you should listen to it. It actually was pretty good. It actually was terrific, but that's another story. When I finished, there were no jobs. All right, and I got hired to teach world religions. Today, I could get up. The other day, I'm in an Italian restaurant, and I wanted to get up. I wanted to do it today on the plane, too, except that I figured I'd get taken off the plane and just say, who knows what Shariah is? Let's talk about Islam. Okay, in any community people may not know what those words really mean, but they're not terms where somebody's just looking. Yet during the Iranian Revolution, Tom Brokaw felt the need to stop and say to people as they were reporting on the hostages and say Islam is the second of the world's religions. It has a book called the Quran, a scripture, and a prophet named Muhammad. Okay. Now look at where we are today in terms of terminology. Words like jihad, Sharia. A whole host. Okay. With the way that it's painted. When we talk about this, the question of Islam and Sharia today, and Sharia for me, like jihad, has become, or like the prophet, becomes a symbol for the other side. in terms of the kinds of attacks that they want to make. It's important to realize that this is not something that's just a 9/11 phenomenon. And I want to make that point. If you go back and look at writings in the late 90s, I did a second edition of my Islamic Threat. I don't know if it was in the first edition, but the second edition, which came out like 1999, I talked and tracked in the 1990s the emergence in Europe and America, and you've got all the great titles at that time. The Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. Jihad comes to America, etc. So this is before 9/11. Okay, 9/11, of course, is the big event that really puts it on the screen, because we all know how Americans responded. People outside of America aren't aware of the extent to which that touched everybody in America, both because of the attacks, and we'd never been attacked at home, but also because the immediate aftermath. That is, going the week after, going to O'Hare Airport and seeing people in battle uniforms with weapons and attack dogs, not attack dogs, but shepherds, etc. And living that phenomenon then, that sense of insecurity, and having a president that hyped, that fear, okay, that then created a context so that you then could see the situation that then occurs over the years with every time there's an attack overseas. First, it's Al-Qaeda's the big enemy and Al-Qaeda lookalikes, and even if they're just a lookalike, it's still sort of Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, its wannabes. Now it's ISIS, which dominates everything. There isn't a day, if you're on the internet and if you're reading especially things like the AAR Islam section or Sociology of Islam, I mean, all you see articles on ISIS and debates over ISIS and everything, and you've got the presidents holding a 3-day summit, et cetera, et cetera, okay? You have also the French prime minister just basically declared the Muslim Brotherhood, Haram, a terrorist organization. You have all of that mobilization taking place. More recently, that is, in the last year, we see attacks in Ottawa, Sydney, Paris, Copenhagen, etc., which just juice up these issues. And we have Roger Cohen's piece the other day, in which Roger Cohen tells us, remember we had Sam Huntington and Bernard Lewis, Clash of Civilizations. Roger Cohen says Islam's war with the West. It is Islam's war with the West, so let's not back off it. And you see the discussion of the Atlantic article and the interview with Bernard Heikel, and many saying, or if you look at the New York Times today, there's a report on the president being very careful about his language and how a lot of people think that that's not being accurate. That in fact, as it were, let's call a spade a spade. So, Islam and Sharia today are deeply impacted by our global context. The context in which ignorance is bliss has now become ignorance is dangerous. It's dangerous. The ignorance of people, the bias that they have. We talk about an information age. It is a disinformation age also, to a great extent. If we talk about a good deal of the internet, if we talk about some of our mass media, if we talk about, and I'll be citing some people, if we talk about some of our major political leaders, if we talk about media commentators, if we talk about hardline Christian Zionists like John Hagee and Rod Parsley and Franklin Graham, etc. Okay? That fundamental question of whether Islam and Sharia are halal or haram, in many ways, for a segment of the population, the jury's already in. And again, I think we all have those experiences, but probably some of us who are associated with this field of study have it more than others. That is, people who even know us, even people who we socialize with, but who may in fact have a very different view than we do, or at least it will surface at times. You see them and they turn to you and say, "So, things must be busy today, given what's happened," and then you just have a sense that conversation's going to go down the wrong street. Okay. So that's out there. 4 important factors that influence this, and I think this is important also, is this doesn't just come from the accusations that are just, like totally fabricated. You have to look at the laws and practices of some Muslim countries. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. there are practices and actions that take place there that epitomize for people, well, wait a second. Many of the religious leaders there and many of the people that support this, they say this is Shariah. Blasphemy laws, the apostasy laws, and the way they're meted out. The use of beheading in some countries, in particular Saudi Arabia. A very high level and a variety of actions. In fact, after I will quote a statement from Pamela Geller, and you can see how she can play off some of this. So you've got that, as it were, that fact on the ground. Now, that fact on the ground, how it then gets framed or interpreted, is the issue. How it is framed and interpreted by some religious leaders or by some countries that project themselves as Islamic states, as it were, or Islamic republics. The other are laws and practices by the Taliban, by Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS, who say this is true Islam, and we're going to create a caliphate. I thought about tonight, some of us are going to the Sultan's restaurant. The only thing better would have been the caliph's restaurant. I mean, if Pamela Geller could say that I spoke here about this, and you could just see what this group's like, they went to a restaurant called the Caliph, they could have gone to a lot of other places, I looked up to see if you had a Four Seasons here, and it didn't work out. I would have taken you out. Okay, so you've got that, and the kinds of penalties and punishments that they apply. So you've got people doing this in the most barbaric ways. But most importantly, I would argue, are the voices, the blogs, the writings of people who are policymakers, who are the hardline Christian leaders, who are the media commentators, and who are the professional Islamophobes. We'll talk about it later, but many of these professional Islamophobes do it because they have a passion for what they do, but some of them actually get paid pretty good salaries. One of them we tracked down, and there are other studies, but one through IRS returns, his budget last year was $7 million. His salary was close to $600,000. Now, that may be high for many of them, but not super high. I think Geller, just for her blogging on, Atlas Shrugs, I think she takes or takes from her budget. it's her blog, $250,000 or $260,000 just for that. So one can just imagine with all the other little stuff that goes on. Robert Spencer, the royalties from the books that he does, let alone the Jihad Watch, he gets his money from Horowitz, both in the creation of his site and also paying just that part of the salary. Again, if you just looked at Spencer's salary, you might look and say, well, it's not overwhelming. It's a very good salary, but that's just for that little piece. Then put in the royalties, then talk in the speaking, then talk about the other sites that they do. Okay. A third major factor is the role of print media, and the fourth is the organized Islamophobia network, and I want to unpack both of those. You also picked a great venue. I just had this. It's really funny. As soon as I saw this place, I thought, my God, A, it's warm, and B, it just has a very warm feeling. So I feel very relaxed here. I didn't think I would. When I get relaxed, I cry a lot, so that's a big addition. By the way, I should say, if you have, seriously, a wedding, a wake, I don't have to know the person. I'm really the guy you want. My wedding, I cried, my wife didn't. Everybody leaves the church, you come to the bride and groom, there I am. I didn't expect it, and there's my wife handling everybody really well. Hi, well, welcome to the wedding. Well, I'm off. Okay. So in any case, I just say that because I'm not retiring, but I'm trying to put together an option for after I retire. All right, so let's take a look at the role of print media. Now, there's a group called Media Tenor, Media and then Tenor, Tenor. You can go and look them up on the internet. They're based in Switzerland. They monitor Western media, particularly European and American media, mainstream, print media, okay? And they also monitor TV in a lot of their studies. Okay? They did a study which looked at for 975,000 pieces, roughly 975,000 pieces of media between 2001 and 2011. They have a staff, they had a staff of 200, now I think they have a somewhat smaller than that literally looks at all that media, puts it on a computer, and so that basically like a content, particularly headlines and content analysis. So 975,000 pieces. 2001, when they looked at the coverage of all the media, they're just looking at media, they discover that 2% of all the media coverage is concerned with, if you will, Islamic extremism. Okay? 0.1% deals with what do most Muslims do and how they live their lives. In other words, the context of the Muslim world and the experience is 0.1%, 2% extremism. 2011, 10 years later, the 2% jumps to 25%. Quantum leap. 2% goes to 25%. Okay? The context, 0.1%, goes to 0.1%. Remains the same. Now you have this incredible disparity. They did a study 2 years later that showed that things are getting worse for a variety of reasons. And it's complicated by the fact also that you have fewer people out in the field, and so that just also opens that possibility. And then they did one, I think, might have been right after the Paris or just before. But so if you go to their website, some of that's up there. But think about, for a second, what we're talking about here. Over a 10-year period, 975,000 pieces in mainstream print and TV, and you're talking 2% goes to 28%. Well, many of us kind of know that if you track it. That's not surprising. But the idea that 0.1% remains 0.1%, then you're really talking about an incredible disparity. It's the equivalent of every day having a diet of Rush Limbaugh, Hannity, and Crew, okay, and O'Reilly, and that's all you look at for news from my point of view. Now, if you take that and then you use a kind of multiplier effect, in our society, as you know, people just have their channel of choice. People have their websites of choice. So, in fact, we've become such a polarized society increasingly culturally that that's exactly what happens. People have certain news sources. I mean, I've had situations with people that are close to me where they inform me of something that's been written about me or somebody else. In fact, the other night I was talking to a friend, and he referred to something that had only happened 2 days before, an event that I wasn't aware that the media had even covered, and apparently had seen something on it. Sami Al-Arian? Any of you know the name? Just raise your hand so at least I know somebody. Okay. Sami Al-Arian, University of Florida. I'm not going to through the whole case. But 2 days after Sami moved to Istanbul, I'm having dinner with somebody, and he knows, and I know it's because he's following these outlets, and I don't even get an alert that something's on the outlet. I don't even know that Sami knows that somebody somehow knows that he legally was able to go to Istanbul, but is now, written on it. So that kind of media context. Now, move to social media, and the plot thickens even more. I should mention that the university is Georgetown University. Our center within Georgetown University, it's not Georgetown University, it's our center, is launching officially. It's existed for about a year. That is getting started, but we're launching a 5-year project on pluralism, diversity, and Islamophobia. And we're doing the official launch in April, as well as our website. I mention that simply because I'm getting into some of this stuff, and some of this comes from what we do. Attitudes and behaviors towards Islam and Muslims have devolved rather than evolved in the last decade. The previous citation from media that I gave you, let alone when you then move to the internet. It gets complicated on the internet by the fact that you also have within the internet what we would call an organized Islamophobia network, called OIN, Organized Islamophobia Network. What that means is, among other things, that what you've got are pundits, bloggers, authors, you've got sites, you've got documentaries that get put on the internet, and you also have that complemented by elected officials and the stuff that they say. I'm actually writing a book, and hopefully it will be my last book. I announced 3 years ago I'd never write another book, and we just sent one off to Oxford, and That's not the royal way. It's a co-sponsored book. This will shock my wife that I'm going to say this. This is true. I have had 2 incredible dreams in the last 6 months. One is that I was almost elected Pope. I made it to the 3rd round. When you run for Pope, there have been stories on this. If it goes to 3 rounds, you're out. But I got that close. And then, wallahi, a week ago, president. I was in the final race. I don't remember the particulars, but I remember, and in either case, I kept thinking, I'll have my own plane. I'll have my own plane. That's all I want is my own plane. But in any case, those are 2 real dreams, which really show you why I should get back on my medication. Okay, so what you got here is a cottage industry. And what do I mean by this cottage industry? Yes, you've got a lot of sites and authors who really don't, let's say, hang out together, but you have others that cross-fertilize each other. You'll have an author on one website will write for another website. You'll have somebody publish something on a website, and then the others pick it up. Some of us who've been featured know that often the same incident will be the subject of, I went and looked up something, the Dallas event that I referred to. About a week ago, I decided to look it up. I put it into the search. On the first page, all you got were 4 pieces, right? First one, Jihad Watch. Next 3, other sites, same story, sometimes same title, sometimes different title, so that you get a multiplier effect, okay? And the multiplier effect is important because, number one, if you actually, and we've done a study, if you look at what some of us would identify as sites that are primarily anti-Muslim and anti-Islam sites. And let me make clear, I'm not talking about being critical in an empirical way about Islam or Muslims, okay? We're talking about a bias, okay? A bias towards a religion or towards a people that borders on and can be a form of racism, okay? But those sites, the number of those sites, far in their impact outweigh some really good counter sites in terms of numbers of hits, like Loon Watch, etc. Far, the numbers are just, okay, they outweigh. But the important thing is they cross-fertilize, okay? The incredible funding they have, which I'll refer to in a second, which we don't even know the whole amount, but 2 major studies have surfaced at least or more than $160 million, okay? All right. But the fact that they also feed other sites. In other words, you have so many sites on the internet, for example, that might be seen as Tea Party, neocon, so broadly they have a lot of topics that they cover. But among the topics might be also that they're anti-immigrant, or they have issues with the Middle East, and or if that's the case, they have problems with and run pieces on Islam and Muslims. So therefore, if something's on Jihad Watch, it's not only going to be on some of the other websites that have similar names, but you're going to have it on other things like national security, family security. What's the one I really like? Now I block it out. It's got a real kind of intellectual sort of. American Thinker, I think, is one of them. So therefore they're feeding all these other sites. Now you've got an incredible number of sites. So you got one hell of an uphill battle when you've got something that is so well funded, so well organized, with such a network of sites. Therefore, if you start a site that's really first class, that's nice. What kind of impact is that going to have compared to something else that has, with the funding, remember, what the funding means is, among other things, you have staff, enormous staff. You can learn how to penetrate the technology, to use the technology to penetrate and get your pieces placed so that they come up in certain places on the internet. So all of that comes to play. So you've got this cottage industry. So you've got Islamophobic talking points, you've got conspiracy theories, you have narratives. Now, with those narratives that are out there and are introduced on a mass scale on the internet as a testing ground, and then when they go viral, then get picked up by mainstream, the challenge is, how do you offset that? You've got one heck of a, of a magnitude here. Okay. The funding Center for American Progress looked at just 7 philanthropies whose funding amounted to $42.5 million. CARE looked at 3-year period, found $119 million, and both of these studies are based on IRS returns. So people can say, well, what do you expect? It's the liberal Center for American, it's CARE, we all know what CARE is. These are IRS returns. And I have to say, if you learn how to do it, you can get a rush. One of the guys that works on our project just did it on this one person, and wow, you just realize why people get in it. It's like, he discovers things that, obviously he's discovering things that, in this case, exist, but the ability to use IRS returns so it can't be refuted, so you know where the funding's coming from, the amounts. Now, why is this also important? You take Breivik, right? The Norwegian, they never really wanted to call him exactly a Christian terrorist, even though he says he's a Christian. They didn't want to use the word terrorist. You just say, well, he's a little out of it. He's obviously a guy that's got problems, et cetera, okay? Breivik, in his book, cites many of these people. I think he cites Spencer and Jihad Watch more than 100 times, and cites a number of others. And also the European guys come in. So that's Anders Breivik. Killed 78 people, remember that. And these are the kind of people he fed off. He devotes a whole page, I'm happy to say, to my center and me in particular, which is wonderful. But again, you get into the connection. Who does he draw off? He reads Martin Kramer. And Martin Kramer is working out of another context. So you see how people have. On the other hand, it's good to see that both Spencer and Geller were refused entry to the UK for speaking engagement. Of course, they then came back, and as they do, they go on assault when they're challenged. They work in cohort together. A number of the sites they founded themselves. Things like Islamization of America, and now you have Islamization of Europe. They work internationally. So, there's a real connection, between the two of them. You've got Frank Gaffney, the Center for Security Policy. He pays Yerushalmi a significant consulting fee. That's just a little bit, and I'm going to come, because Yerushalmi is the guy who develops the whole Shariah issue, okay, who developed that whole Shariah issue, okay. So there's a connection there, okay, as well as connections, between these folks with some of the other people. But in this case, you see the cross-fertilization. They team up with local Tea Party outfits and anti-Muslim organizations like Bridget Gabriel, Act for America, and they get the word out about the bill and the lobby that's out there, okay? So now let's talk a bit about that, okay? Just want to, there was something here. I had to have my wife print out something for me, and I think what happened was she printed on both sides of the page. So I just want to make sure that I didn't miss, okay. I touched on all the bad people and referred to them. Is this something I should be wearing or something, or just wear it because you have it there? Okay, good. Wait, it's the wrong place. Relax, don't have to come up here. I'm a full adult. Albania, I can do that? I can do this, okay. We're going to do it. Just wait a second. There we go. All right. So let's listen to some of the voices out there. Daniel Pipes, one of my good friends and running partners, he has made his statements about Sharia. And I'm not going to do that one because I've got other Sharia comments in terms of the Sharia and the anti-Sharia law. But I want you to see the kind of background thing. Now, on Daniel, I should tell you that when I did the second edition, I think, of Islamic Threat, I wanted a catchier title for the last chapter. I think I changed the title for the last chapter, the second edition. I think it was the first. So I'm trying to think of it, what will grab somebody. It's like when I did the title, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, and then had so many people say, oh, what a bad title, I'm saying, no, that'll get people to take the book and read and see what's really going on. Oh, no, but people won't know what you're really saying. Well, there's a big question mark there. It is true for the Serbian translation, they just said the Islamic Threat. No myth, reality, no question mark, but that's another point. Nobody here reads Serbian, or most people don't. You don't have to worry about it. Pipes, one of his quotes, the Muslim population in this country is not like any other group. It includes within it a substantial body of people, many times more numerous than the agents of Osama bin Laden,
who share with the suicide hijackers a hatred of the U.S. and a desire ultimately to transform it into a nation living under the strictures of militant Islam, the Islamic States of America. Of course, the next iteration is to say living under Sharia. Now, Pipes let a lot of you American Muslims off easy, because for Europe, when he referred to European Muslims, he talked about the fact that, we absorb many groups, but there's something about the Muslim population compared to other foreign. Their food smells differently. They kind of smell differently. It was just like very personal. You can look up that quote, it's also in my writing. But if you really read the kind of stuff, you'd read it like this kind of bold racism, kind of exceptional. There's something about them getting inside somebody's skin. They are so different. Not even saying intellectually, it's just, that kind of really deep personal. Robert Spencer says, of course, as I've pointed out many times, traditional Islam itself is not moderate or peaceful. It's the only major religion with a developed doctrine and tradition of warfare against unbelievers. This is Robert Spencer, the deacon in his church and an authority. He writes on Christianity and Islam, and we suddenly discover that it's only Islam that has this. It's very interesting. Sharia, he says, denies freedom of speech. Under Sharia, if you're a Muslim and you leave them, you're liable to be killed. Under Sharia, there is discrimination institutionalized against women and against non-Muslims. That is anti-American. Thank you, Robert. That is anti-freedom. That is anti-human. And we will not let that stand. We are here to stand for America. And that's where you get that phrase. Now, what about the anti-Sharia legislation? Well, as some of you know, it really took off with the Park 51, the Cordoba House, or as it came to be known popularly, the mosque at Ground Zero, which is neither a mosque nor at Ground Zero. If you've ever gone to see the original building, it's really amazing how upset they were getting, etc. And if you look at the original plan, originally they were inspired by the 92nd Street Y, the Jewish Y, which I've spoken at, which is an institution that's iconic in New York. Because it's basically this huge building with all kinds of projects on literature, all kinds of programs for the whole community, not just the Jewish community, the whole community, for daycare, for swimming pool, as the Ys have, etc. But in that overflow, you remember we had a tsunami of moves against mosques. So you had more mosque attacks. You also had from New York to California, attempting to block mosques, discovering in Murfreesburg, Tennessee, that, oh my God, that mosque that's been there all that time, people should really know that they probably have weapons inside, etc. Or discovering that, oh, this man that's lived here for years and had a police escort, which they usually use for his burial, well, we better investigate that. That probably shouldn't have happened. You also then had, as a spin-off, or what took off after that, is the anti-Sharia bill. Now, the interesting thing about the anti-Sharia law is that it is championed by, as you know, this kind of attitude, by names like Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and Michelle Bachmann. All the other three I'm dedicating the Oxford book on what everyone needs to know about Sharia. Will be dedicated to them. They will get free copies. And if I could get them to distribute it, my royalties would be incredible. But they might also learn something. But they're the people that are out there, and they're the people who were in mainstream politics. Michelle Bachmann, thank God, is has pulled out. But Rick Santorum may take another run for the presidency. And you've got that kind of profile, and a lot of other folks, and I'll mention some of them after. What you wind up with then is some 32 states in which legislation has been introduced or attempted to be introduced. 8 states have passed legislation banning that law. Now, I should note that what happened early on, when it started to get thrown out by their merely targeting Sharia, they then changed it to foreign laws. But if you look at the states where it's happening and the way, the purpose and the intent, the whole idea was, in other words, it really is a kind of fig leaf rather than using the word Sharia, because it had been, the Oklahoma law had been then found to be, in effect, unconstitutional and thrown out. So then they changed the approach. But the guy behind it is David Yerushalmi, who is an Israeli citizen as well as an American citizen. The last I read, he lives overseas like half the year and then is here for half the year. An attorney, he represents, guess who? Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. And Frank Gaffney, he's got a consulting fee coming from. So he drafted the cookie cutter legislation that formed the early iterations of the current foreign law. The bill, which explicitly mentioned Sharia and Islam, was first introduced in Oklahoma in 2010. I did a series of lectures in Oklahoma when it first came out, and the good thing was that the faculty there had a sense of humor. At both universities, they sort of introduced it as, we're the sort of anti-Sharia state, and they wanted to welcome me before I gave my talk. The fact is, if you look at the stats on the number of people who voted, which are overwhelming, the idea that they would have any idea what Sharia was like, but Sharia became a symbol of that threat. In other words, it would be like in the old days saying, it's communist. He's a communist, those ideas are communist, that's communism, this law you want to pass is communism, or is communism and socialism, So as soon as you can use a word, you've got the taint, and it points to, if you will, the Franklin Graham idea that Islam is evil. Or as John Cummins, turned out it's a pseudonym, wrote in the 1990s in the UK, the black heart of Islam. It's that kind of mentality. That was immediately challenged in court, ultimately struck down as unconstitutional. Now they've changed the approach, but the foreign law is the basic attempt is to call it foreign law and have this veneer to move forward. Now, on the ground, Yerushalmi's vision meets grassroots activists, neoconservatives, Tea Party circles, at state houses, and it gains traction. Proponents of the law, well, I'll skip that part. Tellingly, in a New York Times article, this is really interesting. Here he is, Yerushalmi, and he's asked about whether or not the anti-Sharia bills were really intended to fix a problem. He said no. Were they really intended to fix a problem? He said no. They were intended, the bills were intended to be heuristic. Now, I'm from Brooklyn, so I don't know what heuristic means, but he explains it a little bit later, okay? All right. In other words, to make Americans aware of Sharia as a threat. So they weren't intended to really fix a problem, but to make it aware. And that's what the whole thing is about. When you can get it out and get Oklahomans to panic, when you can get people in all these different states, the reason why they're voting, they don't even know what it is that the sense is this is part of that threat. And this is a tangible part. This is Sharia, it's the laws that these people follow, We don't know what it is, but we do know what goes on in some countries. You can't deny that. And we do know what ISIS does. But the real question is, does anybody get out there and explain what Sharia is? And here, let me just give you an aside. This is going on much longer than it should, but that's okay. God, I love listening to myself. You get to a certain point where really the only person you really like to listen to. I never fall asleep when I listen to myself. But when I listen to imams speak, I listen to most clergy speak, listen to some of my good colleagues speak, not Ingrid, not Sherman, not, et cetera, but here we are. Okay. So this idea of it being, and this is the thing, that Sharia comes for people to embody, it personalizes, embodies the threat, okay? All right. But part of the problem is a problem that we have as scholars and a problem that we have as a community, as a diverse community. And it's a problem that Muslims have historically and continue to have from my point of view. And that is a failure to distinguish between Sharia and Islamic law. That is Sharia as divine law and Islamic law as a human interpretation that occurred in a historical context, that drew off sacred sources, but also was heavily infused by independent thinking, by local custom and practice that in a certain age was normal, whether it be the way in which people were marginalized, were punished, were penalized, etc. Unless that distinction is made, Sharia then comes to sanctify an historical interpretation, a good deal of which is open to reinterpretation, And that position is held by both some so-called very conservative prominent religious leaders as well as reformists. And here I would just say, not that I get into it in any great detail, but in my book, Future of Islam, I deal with this. To me, it became fascinating, and I'd studied a group of people separately, but when I put them together, I suddenly realized that you could have people who were using a very traditional approach methodologically and people using a more modern approach methodologically, but at the end of the day arguing to the same constructive reformist position. Okay? So unless that distinction is made, it affects both the Muslim community, but it certainly affects the perception of what Islam is about and what Islamic law is about. So that Sharia / and Islamic law, the interpretation, takes on a notion of the sacralization of everything, not just sacred sources, but culture, practices of the past, in a way that we don't use when we talk about Jewish law, if we realize the diversity of Jewish law. You see, rather than this kind of, univocal, monolithic thing, or talking about canon law. 4 common themes of anti-Sharia are: Sharia law advocates the overthrow of Western civilization, the establishment of an Islamic caliphate. And ISIS, of course, comes in and, corroborates that. Ironically, makes that haram halal for some people in terms of the way it gets spun out and believed. Sharia law is what all Muslims adhere to. There's no moderate form of it. And moderate Muslims are either pretending to be moderate or not adhering to true Sharia law. When we at Gallup, and I'm no longer with Gallup, but I'm using we at Gallup because when I work with them and we did that study of, whatever, what is it? Who speaks for Islam? What a billion Muslims really think. You discover that majorities of Muslims across the world want to see democracy and Sharia. But what they mean by Sharia is very diverse in terms of their understanding and even, as it were, how much of Sharia, what aspects of Sharia they would want to see implemented. Third, that people in the United States need to stand up to Sharia. You see? So we've got stand with the Prophet, and then we have stand up to Sharia. Or else the Muslims will take over America. The Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. That was article Daniel Pipes had written before. Daniel pointed that out to me. And I was going to say, I made that up. I can't believe anybody would actually have that on the title of an article that they wrote. The fourth, Sharia law is inherently anti-women, anti-freedom, and against all other religions. Okay. Here's just a few quotes, and then I'll wrap this up. David Yerushalmi says Sharia is a criminal conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. Go right to the heart of it in terms of claims made. Militants do not pervert Islamic law. He says Islamic law is an authoritative doctrine that seeks global hegemony. And this is a mission shared by all Muslims around the world. See, by all Muslims. It's a little bit like Bridget of Act for America, who winds up saying, in effect, takes a position in others, I'm not saying all Muslims are radical, but what I am saying is there's something that's really, Islam is the problem, and therefore, if somebody is a devout Muslim and they pray regularly, they are potential terrorists, and maybe therefore they ought to be, monitored, etc. Newt Gingrich, I believe Sharia is a mortal threat to the survival of freedom in the U.S. and the world as we know it. Stealth jihadis use political, cultural, societal, religious, intellectual tools. Violent jihadis use violence. But in fact, they're both engaged in jihad. See, so then you get back to even when you talk about Islamic movements, you don't have moderate and radical, if you look at the Arab Spring and the response. It's that really you got these stealth people. You've got these wolves in sheep's clothing. So you see, again, stealth jihadis use political, cultural, societal, religious, intellectual tools. This means if you have Muslim leaders who seem open, nonviolent, progressive, Muslim intellectuals, Muslim folks, that really, they're stealth jihadis. And then you've got the obvious ones. Okay. Obviously, when you really take a look at American law, it doesn't, the kind of argument they make doesn't really stand up. The U.S. Constitution reigns. It controls. It dominates. Everything is subject to the U.S. Constitution. It's analogous to the problem that the former Archbishop of Canterbury had when he made a statement about the fact that, maybe the law in Britain at some point, would need to take into account and reflect, as it did with other groups, for example, with regard to Jews and the kind of non-legal sort of, courts that attempt to deal with marital situations, etc. But in fact, was immediately, pummeled because people were saying he's really laying the groundwork for the implementation, as it were, of Shariah. Under American law, and Noah Feldman has written very well on it. Feldman talks about the fact the Constitution of the U.S., the Constitution of every state, that is 51 constitutions, already make it illegal to implement Islamic law, just as Jewish law can't be the law of the U.S., and canon law can't be the law of the U.S., Sharia law can't be the law of the United States. In conclusion, this topic is important in and of itself, but it's important because it's symptomatic of the broader problem that we have. We do have a culture war taking place, both internationally and in the West, in Europe and the U.S. It takes different forms, but the background is a culture war. You can say whatever you want to say in most media about Islam and Muslims. You can say things that you would never dare say about Jews, about Catholics, about African Americans today, that you could have said when they were coming into the system. Okay? But today, everything is out there. You can say to them or of people that deal with it. You can make accusations that, that would be seen as unacceptable libels, that editors wouldn't publish. Part of the reason, of course, is that you don't have a significant enough percentage of the population with the lobby and muscle that other groups have, whether it's Jews, whether it's ethnic Catholics, whether it's my people, who are the salt of the earth. But without that lever, it makes it even more acceptable. And more importantly, is if it bleeds, it leads. When O'Reilly's guy came to Dallas, he wanted to come in. The media wanted, to come in. And so the media was allowed to come in for the first 20 minutes. Because the idea was this is a community fundraiser, and you've got members of the community. We're not going to come in and have the cameras all over the place. I mean, people go to dinner, they're not looking to, suddenly, have, their faces out and then commentary the next day. So the idea is this is supposed to be a fundraiser. I must say, the Dallas community showed the maturity of the Muslim community. If this were a number of years ago in many communities, and even today, there would be a natural human situation of saying, maybe I won't go. A couple of people canceled, but in fact, they had such an overflow that then got triggered that they had to get another room. So that they had, I don't know, maybe went from maybe 500 to 750 people or something that wound up coming to that fundraiser. That realized at this point, if you give in to what they want and you cancel that meeting, you lose and they win. And I think that is very important to realize. But that culture war is embedded now in the way that people talk about Islam, talk about Muslims, and it gets hyped every time there's an attack. And the irony is it's predictable. The fact is we know if things are quiet for another 5 years, if there's another attack, there's going to be a problem. But I would just end by telling you to note this. This is really astonishing. I mean, because I see the brilliance really working in our society. We have tens of thousands. The numbers of people in government that are analysts, the size of DHS is awesome. Not just its budgets, the number of people. This isn't a criticism of our government agencies. I'm just doing a lead-in here. Let alone the size of our State Department, our Pentagon. We have so many experts. We have more terrorist experts than we have terrorists in the world, and more people who believe they're terrorist experts, and more people who worked on one part of the world, and then because they're terrorist experts, you just bring your methodology along. It's the methodology approach. have a bit of problem with social sciences and their approach sometimes to methodology. I got a methodology, you know. I remember there was a leading social scientist and really good guy. And I was at a conference with him and he did his routine on, you know, one religion and another, you know. And I finally said, well, you're talking about liberation theology in Latin America. Did you actually, you know, go down? And no, I rely on some really good secondary sources, but I did it. So then I said, well, you know, you ought to do an article that just does all the world's religions. He said, funny you should mention that. I just finished a piece on that. You know? So you got the methodology, you then can, you know, pull off some secondary sources and you can talk about radicalism all over the world, okay? So we've got all of that going. And what do we see? Do you remember after 9/11, people began to say in Congress, like the first week, some of them, we need to look at some of the root causes. And you remember the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense said, that's un-American. I did a long interview with the Wall Street Journal and I said to the guy, it's amazing you're doing this. He said, I had to really work with my editor because people don't want to touch. It looks like you're trying to justify. 60 Minutes, which goes everywhere and anywhere, was coming to interview. Not only to interview, they were going to spend a day or two with me because they wanted to go to my classes, etc. Right up until the night before, they were coming. And we're setting everything up. And that morning, I'm literally driving into my office. I'm 4 blocks away. And I call my assistant and I say, why don't you call 60 Minutes and see if they actually are on the train and they're coming down? And she said, no, I just spoke with them yesterday. They're coming. I said, just call. Sure enough, oh, gee, you know, something came up. We're not going to do it. This was like right after it, okay? Then what did we discover? Well, we were really shocked to find out that so many of the people who were the attackers didn't have a history of being devout Muslims. And some of them used to do nightclubs, they used to do X, Y, and Z, and they weren't all out of the Palestinian camps or the equivalent, you know, the poor, the destitute, etc. Okay? So then the question became, okay, let's take a look and see how much is religion, how much of it can it be conditions in society. The old approach to a lot of this used to be the psychological approach all the time. In other words, so it was really the kind of psychologist, psychiatrist who would come in on terrorism and just talk about the mind of the terrorist. No, but let's look at the kind of conditions. Well, we've gone through multiple iterations of that. Now we have the attacks in France, we have the attacks in Copenhagen. You will note that the French government has announced that it is going to now reach out and develop the suburbs of Paris, where it had those, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, where it had a real problem in the past. And remember, they reported it as Muslims, when in fact these were people from North Africa whose basic identity was North African. I mean, many of them didn't necessarily identify themselves as Muslims. At the time, there was no big finding that they, you know, that they were all somehow devout, somehow, you know, in some sort of, you know, jihadist camp. Often we find even more recently that a number of people have a track record of being born in a ghetto, being thugs, having a criminal record, and then maybe in prison in the last year or two, or they run into maybe, you know, a jihadi preacher, you know, you get involved. But many of them know very little about religion. You had the case in the UK. 2 people who were going off to fight in Syria were found guilty, and at the trial it turned out that they had ordered on Amazon, you know, the Quran for dummies and Islam for dummies. I mean, because they were getting ready to go to Syria. I mean, what are you going to do? And you're going to, you know, you're going to take your oath to the caliph. You ought to at least have some sense of, you know, faking it. So we're at this point where we're dealing with a situation that has had this incredible multiplier effect, and it will continue because ISIS will continue in the short term. And the fact is, as we know, the French begin to realize, and they suddenly say, oh, we're going to devote more to development. Why? Because it turns out that the amount of money they put into French schools in Paris as opposed to the periphery is like twice what they put into the development of the schools. So if you have lousy schools, people don't get a good education, they can't get a good job. But even worse, studies that were done after the first set of riots showed that part of the problem was you didn't have good transportation to even get to the city so that you could go in and then get turned down because you didn't have the credentials. I mean, so you're living in these kinds of isolated situations, and yet you still have people, if you follow the discussion now, saying this is all peripheral. Don't get into those issues. So it becomes very important, it seems to me, at this particular point in our history to realize that things are not getting better. They're getting worse, and they have the potential to get worse. And when these kinds of attacks take place, they will continue. And when people simply want to say and take positions that actually wind up legitimating ISIS, the criticism of the president for being sensitive about not legitimating ISIS' own claim that just because it says, as it were, it represents true Islam, that is true Islam, whatever that means, and there are multiple interpretations. I mean, one needs to keep that in mind because we're coming up for another round of elections. One can only imagine what a world with Marco Rubio will be like. He may be able to get you Cohiba cigars, but I mean, other than that, I'm not sure Marco's going to deliver on a lot of the issues that we're concerned about. So I would just end by saying that when, in fact, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you could say that there are people out there saying the Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming. What you can say now is that their ability to transform popular culture has increased exponentially due to a movement beyond what we used to consider mainstream media, a mainstream media that most people aren't exposed to. That is, most Americans really don't go to major newspapers to get their information. And most Americans, or many Americans, when they deal with TV, actually, if they do follow the news, usually look at the equivalent of Fox and MSNBC, depending on what the camp is. You factor in now the internet with the enormous impact that it has and the enormous presence that you have of people who are ideologically driven or politically driven or religiously driven and or slash you can be a success at it, you can have a name, you can have instant exposure, and you can also make money at it. And I wouldn't take away any of those things. People who work on the internet, and it's not their primary driver, but they can do as well in terms of name recognition and money as Sean Hannity. And Sean embodies, I believe I'm going to say this, the mediocrity that we face. Thank you.